Breaking news again this morning, as you've heard, Fidel Castro dead at the age of 90. This is live footage of Miami, where Cuban-American community and Americans across the country are celebrating. We want to bring in a very special guest this morning, Senator Marco Rubio, newly elected Florida senator, re-elected and former presidential candidate, and one of the most prominent voices in the Cuban-American community in this country. You've spoken out for years against the Castro regime. What does this day mean to you?
Well, I think first we need to understand what it means to Cuba, and the dictator is dead, but not the dictatorship. It continues to be a dictatorship. This transition to power basically happened 10 years ago, beginning in 2006. And so their system of government, where he's kind of been I guess, dictator, who's been hanging around and giving advice and writing columns and so forth. But in essence, the leadership of the day-to-day governance passed to his brother Raul quite a while ago. For the community, there's a lot of people out there today whose parents have passed away, who did not see this day, but really the day their parents wanted to see was not the death of Castro. What they wanted to see was a different system of government and a different future for Cuba. And so it's one of those days where people are going to react to it. This would have been very different if it was 15 or 20 years ago. But in the end, when it's all said and done, you're going to have the same system of government in place in Cuba that you had last night before Fidel Castro's death. So it's a newsworthy event, but I don't really think it changes anything in Cuba.
Senator, you were very critical on the campaign trail, obviously, of the deal that this administration cut through executive action to open up some economic activity and normalize relations with Cuba. Does something like this create a new opportunity for more political liberalization, for potentially regime change down the line? What does it mean?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, so the argument is that some have made is, well, until Fidel, as long as Fidel's around and alive and capable of writing columns criticizing his own brother and others, you're not going to see the Cuban government prepared to move towards more liberalization. Well, I'm not necessarily an adherent to that viewpoint. My criticism of the deal has not been that we changed our relationship to Cuba. My criticism has been that we've made over 50 to 60 individual concessions, all of which benefit the Cuban government. And they've made none. I mean, they've made absolutely no changes in their system of government. And I just think one-sided deals of that manner and that fashion are bad for the Cuban people and the United States. So you would hope that there's a chance for reexamination, but I don't really believe so. I think the system of government they have in place is going to be difficult to change as long as certain people are still around, and that includes Raul Castro.
Senator, this is Dana, and I wondered if you could weigh in on what you think the Obama administration should do in regards to the funeral, and should they send a representative, and if so, what level might be appropriate?
Well, if you send a representative of the Obama administration and the U.S. government to that funeral, you are sending someone to the funeral of a man who ordered the execution of Americans, including the Brothers to the Rescue. Let's not forget this happened back in 1996. Where you had civilian aircraft over international waters, unarmed. They were patrolling, looking for rafters in the sea to save their lives, and the Cubans shot 2 of those planes down with MiGs. And there were American citizens on those planes. And so that kind of thing cannot happen in Cuba without Fidel Castro's direct order. So you are basically sending to the funeral you're sending high-ranking American officials to the funeral of a man who murdered American citizens less than 20 years ago, whose families have gotten judgments against the Cuban government and U.S. courts, and who still live in South Florida and would painfully have to watch that. So I would hope they would send no one to the funeral, because while you may want to open up to Cuba, there's no reason why we should be opening up to Fidel Castro's legacy of anti-Americanism, of murder, of dictatorship, of imprisonment, of exile, which is what his legacy is all about.
Senator, it's Ed Henry, and I wonder, the person who's going to have to deal with charting this way forward for America and the approach to Cuba and all these other hotspots around the world, obviously, will be President-elect Donald Trump. And as he decides on nominating a Secretary of State, someone that you as a member of the Senate obviously will be able to weigh in on, what do you think about these reports that Mitt Romney may have to apologize for some of the things he said during the campaign if he wants to become Secretary of State?
Well, that would be an internal matter for them to handle. I don't know if those reports are true or not. I've been around this now long enough to know that a lot of times what was reported out there is one person's agenda, not necessarily accurate. But I have no insight to that. I like Mitt Romney very much. I think he's highly capable, but I'm not. It's up to the president-elect to decide who he wants to serve him, and then it's up to us in the Senate to ensure that it's the right person and confirm them or not.
And
so we're going to wait for that process to play out, and I'm not going to opine on that.
Okay, and Donald Trump was very aggressive in his rhetoric, you remember, during the campaign about saying he wanted to roll back some of President Obama's openings to Cuba. Would you recommend, moving forward, that he actually roll some of that back so that you get a fairer deal in your estimation? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah, and how would you do that?
Well, I think that's what I look forward to sitting down and talking through with the administration, is to be strategic about what we do. The objective here is not to punish. The objective here is to achieve a difference in system of government. And I'm not saying that I want Cuba to look like New Zealand in the next 24 months. It's obviously been a big place that's been a communist dictatorship for over 60 years, and it's going to take some time. But you want to see steps moving in the right direction. You've seen examples of that in other places in the world where it's incrementally worked with the right measures. And so we want to ensure that we're not doing anything to reward the Castro regime, that we're not doing anything that allows this system of government to become permanent or accepted, that you're doing everything possible to support those on the island who are fighting for freedom and liberty and basic human rights. And you want to make sure you're doing something that strategically paves the way for what I hope will be a new generation of Cuban leadership that will bring about a more of a political opening on the island than what we've seen so far.
Senator, your family has experienced that oppression firsthand. You addressed earlier how Raul Castro is an extension of Fidel Castro. But for those who maybe haven't paid attention to Cuba for years, what is life really like there, who live under this regime, who may romanticize or be tempted to romanticize the legacy of Fidel Castro today? We're already hearing from some leaders that are doing that. What's it like?
Well, that's one of the things I'm most concerned about. This is now an opportunity for all these apologists to come out and talk about what a great guy Fidel Castro is, because people know how to read, but yet, their fathers and mothers served 20 years in jail. So there's been different stages in the exile experience. My grandfather, for example, came from Cuba in the mid-1960s after going back, basically, because like many Cubans, he thought Fidel was going to be good for the country. There was a lot of hope for Fidel Castro when he took over. Expectations were high. People were very, very hopeful. He himself had said he was a Democrat, that he was going to bring about democracy, and within 3 years, of course, became not just a Marxist, but an anti-American Marxist. So that first generation, people lost their homes, their properties, their entire lives. I mean, you're talking about doctors, lawyers, engineers, businessmen who overnight were washing dishes on Miami Beach. They lost everything. You had people in prison, people executed without any sort of trial. Yeah. And then that process continued up until through the mid-'80s and beyond.
We're going to have to leave it right there. You just heard Senator Rubio's take. Thank you very much, Senator. Dennis Kucinich reacts next.